Good day, my brothers and my sisters, ladies and gentlemen, and children of all ages. We are still in the book, The New Jim Crow by Michelle Alexander. Mass incarceration in the age of color blindness. Mass incarceration in the age of color blindness. Let me finish reading where we were at from episode or part 8. Part 8. And then we'll move on to part 9. Or you can say episode 8, 9. So we're going to start back at episode 8, part 8, the last sentence there. Likewise, she says, the notion that the new Jim Crow can never be dismantled through traditional litigation and policy reform strategies that are wholly disconnected from a major social movement seems fundamentally misguided. We're going on to part 9, we're on page 15, starting at the third paragraph here on page 15. Such a movement is impossible, though, if those most committed to abolishing racial hierarchy continue to talk and behave as if a state-sponsored racial caste system no longer exists. If we continue to tell ourselves the popular myths about racial progress, or worse yet, if we say to ourselves that the problem of mass incarceration is just too big, too daunting for us to do anything about, and that we should instead direct our energies to battles that might be more easily won, history will judge us harshly. A human rights nightmare is occurring on our watch. A new social consensus must be forged about race and the role of race in defining the basic structure of our society, if we hope ever to abolish the new Jim Crow. This new consensus must begin with dialogue, a conversation that fosters a critical consciousness, a key prerequisite to effective social action. This book is an attempt to ensure that the conversation does not end with nervous laughter. It is not possible, she goes on to say, we're still in the introduction on page 15. It is not possible to write a relatively short book. Here, this is important. It is not possible to write a relatively short book that explores all aspects of the phenomenon of mass incarceration and its implications for racial justice. No attempt has been made to do so here, she says. This book paints with a broad brush, and as a result, many important issues have not received the attention they deserve. I say again, this book paints with a broad brush, and as a result, many important issues have not received the attention they deserve. For example, relatively little is said here about the unique experience of women, Latinos, and immigrants in the criminal justice system, which we know that there is a lot to be said about their experiences as well. Though these groups are particularly vulnerable to the worst abuses and suffer in ways that are important and distinct. This book focuses on the experience of African American men in the new caste system. I hope other scholars and advocates will pick up where the book leaves off and develop the critique more fully, or apply the themes sketched here to other groups and other contexts. We're going to try to just finish the introduction today. We got to go to page 19. We're on page 16. What this book is intended to do, the only thing it is intended to do, is to stimulate a much needed conversation about the role of the criminal justice system in creating and perpetuating racial hierarchy in the United States. The fate of millions of people, indeed the future of the black community itself, may depend on the willingness of those who care about racial justice to re-examine their basic assumptions about the role of the criminal justice system in our society. Hear this: the fact that more than half of the young black men in many large American cities are currently under the control of the criminal justice system or saddled with criminal records is not, as many argue, just a symptom of poverty or poor choices, but rather evidence of a new racial caste system at work. Hear this. She goes on to speak about what's coming up in the books. In chapter 1, chapter 1 begins our journey. It briefly reviews the history of racialized social control in the United States, answering the basic question, how did we get here? The chapter describes the control of African Americans through racial caste systems, such as slavery and Jim Crow, which appear to die but then are reborn in new form, tailored to the needs and constraints of the time. As we shall see, there is a certain pattern to the births and deaths of racial caste in America. Time and again, the most ardent proponents of racial hierarchy have succeeded in creating new caste systems by triggering a collapse of resistance across the political spectrum. This feat has been achieved largely by appealing to the racism and vulnerability of lower-class whites, a group of people who are understandably eager to ensure that they never find themselves trapped at the bottom of the American totem pole. Wow. Let's read that sentence again. This feat has been achieved largely by appealing to the racism and vulnerability of lower-class whites, which is a group of people who are understandably eager to ensure that they never find themselves trapped at the bottom of the American totem pole. This pattern, dating back to slavery, has birthed yet another racial caste system in the United States: mass incarceration. We're at the bottom of page 16. The structure of mass incarceration is described in some detail in chapter 2 with a focus on the war on drugs. Few legal rules meaningfully constrain the police in the drug war. Hear this. Few legal rules meaningfully constrain the police in the drug war, and enormous financial incentives have been granted to law enforcement to engage in mass drug arrests through military style tactics. Once swept into the system, one's chances of ever being truly free are slim, often to the vanishing point. Defendants are typically denied meaningful legal representation, pressured by the threat of lengthy sentences into a plea bargain, and then placed under formal control, in prison or jail, on probation or parole. Hear this. Upon release, ex-offenders are discriminated against legally for the rest of their lives, and most will eventually return to prison. They are members of America's new undercaste. Chapter 3 turns our attention to the role of race in the United States criminal justice system. It describes the method to the madness, how a formerly race-neutral criminal justice system can manage to round up, arrest, and imprison an extraordinary number of black and brown men, when people of color are actually no more likely to be guilty of drug crimes and many other offenses than whites. This chapter debunks the notion that rates of black imprisonment can be explained by crime rates and identifies the huge racial disparities at every stage of the criminal justice process, from the initial stop, search, and arrest to the plea bargaining and sentencing phases. In short, the chapter, which is chapter 3, explains how the legal rules that structure the system guarantee discriminatory results. These legal rules ensure that the undercast is overwhelmingly black and brown. I say again, these legal rules ensure that the undercast is overwhelmingly black and brown. Chapter 4 considers how the caste system operates once people are released from prison. In many respects, release from prison does not represent the beginning of freedom, but instead a cruel new phase of stigmatization and control. Myriad laws, rules, and regulations discriminate against ex-offenders and effectively prevent their meaningful reintegration into the mainstream economy and society. She says, I argue that the shame and stigma of the prison label is, in many respects, more damaging to the African American community than the shame and stigma associated with Jim Crow. Hear this: the criminalization and demonization of black men has turned the black community against itself, unraveling community and family relationships, decimating networks of mutual support, and intensifying the shame and self-hate experienced by the current pariah caste. The many parallels between mass incarceration and Jim Crow are explored in Chapter 5. The most obvious parallel is legalized discrimination. Like Jim Crow, because Jim Crow was legal, like Jim Crow, mass incarceration marginalizes large segments of the African American community, segregates them physically in prisons, jails, and ghettos, and then authorizes discrimination against them in voting, employment, housing, education, public benefits, and jury service. The federal court system has effectively immunized the current system from challenges on the grounds of racial bias, much as earlier systems of control were protected and endorsed by the U.S. Supreme Court. The parallels do not end there, however. Mass incarceration, like Jim Crow, helps to define the meaning and significance of race in America. Indeed, the stigma of criminality functions in much the same way that the stigma of race once did. It justifies a legal, social, and economic boundary between us and them. Chapter 5 also explores some of the differences among slavery, Jim Crow, and mass incarceration. Most significantly, the fact that mass incarceration is designed to warehouse a population deemed disposable, unnecessary to the functioning of the new global economy. While earlier systems of control were designed to exploit and control black labor. In addition, the chapter discusses the experience of white people in this new caste system. Although they have not been the primary targets of the drug war, they have been harmed by it. A powerful illustration of how a racial state can harm people of all colors. Finally, this chapter responds to skeptics who claim that mass incarceration cannot be understood as a racial caste system because many get tough on crime policies are supported by African Americans. Many of these claims, I note, are no more persuasive today than arguments made 100 years ago by blacks and whites who claimed that racial segregation simply reflected reality, not racial animus. Because remember, the The Jim Crow laws were the ones that said separate, meaning segregated. But they were trying to say that we were yet equal in this segregation. So blacks could not go where whites were, but whites can go wherever they want. So how is that equal is beyond me. Many get tough on crime policies are supported by African Americans. Many of these claims, I note, are no more persuasive today than arguments made 100 years ago by blacks and whites who claimed that racial segregation simply reflected reality, not racial animus, and that African Americans would be better off not challenging the Jim Crow system, but should focus instead on improving themselves within it. Which is what we hear a lot today. Just improve yourself. In those ghettos, in those black communities, and everything will be fine, everything will be all right. Just improve yourselves. Let's continue to read. Throughout our history, there have been African Americans who, for a variety of reasons, have defended or been complicit with the prevailing system of control. Chapter 6 reflects on what acknowledging the presence of the new Jim Crow means for the future of civil rights advocacy. I argue, she says, that nothing short of a major social movement can successfully dismantle the new caste system. Meaningful reforms can be achieved without such a meaningful reforms can be achieved without such a movement, but unless the public consensus supporting the current system is completely overturned, the basic structure of the new caste system will remain intact. Building a broad-based social movement, however, is not enough. It is not nearly enough to persuade mainstream voters that we have relied too heavily on incarceration or that drug abuse is a public health problem, not a crime. If the movement that emerges to challenge mass incarceration fails to confront squarely the critical role of race in the basic structure of our society, and if it fails to cultivate an ethic of genuine care, compassion, and concern for every human being of every class, race, and nationality within our nation's borders, including poor whites who are often pitted against poor people of color, the collapse of mass incarceration will not mean the death of racial caste in America. Inevitably, a new system of racialized social control will emerge, one that we cannot foresee. Just as the current system of mass incarceration was not predicted by anyone 30 years ago, no task is more urgent for racial justice advocates today than ensuring that America's current racial caste system is its last. That was the introduction, which ended on page 19. Still in this book, The New Jim Crow by Michelle Alexander, Mass Incarceration in the Age of Color Blindness. We will begin chapter 1 in our next episode. I don't want to say a lot because I just want to stick to the book, but I do want to emphasize how important it is that we understand that this is true, what's going on. A lot of us won't be able to see it, a lot of us won't be able to understand it, a lot of us don't believe that it's happening. They say, well, some people have been promoted, blacks are moving up, blacks are doing this is happening and that is happening in the black community. What's happening in the black community? What's happening? We hear about Chicago all the time. We hear about other cities, we hear about other places, and yet still are being, the protesters, the peaceful protesters are being treated as common criminals. So there's something to this. You don't see it most of the time because you don't want to see it. That's why she's calling it color blindness. You see, it's not happening. It's happening to all of us. Let's read this book. Let's continue to read and see what she's talking about, how she breaks it down, points it out, and how she explores and has researched all of this. We'll see that she's pointing out facts and not fiction. Facts and not theory. Facts and not just opinion. Michelle Alexander's book that was written in 2010 is still effective even to this day. People that are getting out of prisons, some of them seem to make it okay decently in the world, some of them, but they still have that stigma of having been locked up, an ex-felon. That stigma is still there. Much more to say on that. Some of them go on to be congressmen or go on to be judges, and we'll look at Judge Mathis, Greg Mathis, but you got to pay attention to what she's saying in this book. Until the next time, my brothers and my sisters, ladies and gentlemen, we'll continue reading this book. I will talk to you again soon.